I'm Kevin Munger, and today I'm talking to you about Vilém Flusser's Communicology, a book that I read as part of a reading group hosted by New Models. So this book is my attempt to answer a question that I've been trying to answer for years, which is, why are things so weird? So in my normal career as a quantitative social scientist, the tools that I use to study social media are incompatible with this problem. And yet I'm convinced that there's something about communication, the internet, social media, which is the answer to this question. So my first attempt to answer this question went through demography. So it's clear that there is something odd about American politics today. We have a gerontocracy, and we can see examples all the time of our politicians being clearly incapable of the task of day-to-day functioning, let alone figuring out how to regulate the internet or be examples for how we should respond to this new communication technology. So I think that's part of the problem, but it's definitely not the whole thing. This is what led me to media theory, and specifically to Vilém Flusser, the sage of Sao Paulo, I call him, this Brazilian Czech media theorist who fled the Nazis to Brazil and brings to us a well-developed system to understand human communication, and one that has not yet been fully incorporated into the English-speaking world. I think that's part of why there's so much to be gained here from studying his thought. Another advantage of Flusser's media theory is that it's much more comprehensive and I think humanistic than other famous media theorists like the cool Marshall McLuhan. We see this in this quote, which is his answer to the question of, why do humans communicate? He says, communication is an artificial, intentional, dialogic, collective act of freedom aiming at creating codes that help us forget our inevitable death. So we see here the confluence of his erudition, the phenomenology, existential philosophy, philosophy of science. And so this is clearly a very well-read and well-intentioned man. And yet, when in the reading group we were working through the text, Communicology, we couldn't help but feel accosted by what he was saying. The various diagrams and formulations that he brings to bear provoked in us a kind of recognition of ourselves and our experience of the internet and social media that was not altogether welcome. In fact, it was kind of nauseating. So we see this reaction to Flusser telling us how we're living, and it doesn't feel very good. So there are a lot of diagrams there. I won't work through all of them today, but there are a few that are essential to the point I need to make. And so this is Flusser's triple alienation. So in the beginning was the world. This is before humans existed and we were animals. We just were in the world. We didn't need some kind of encoded communication. But then the first human emerged, or as Flusser puts it, the first ape went insane and no longer existed in the natural world and needed some kind of communicative capacity to understand itself and the world. And this is what produced the first human, and the first human produced the first encoded communication. In this case, the image. We can think of the Lascaux cave paintings of hunting, and this image, as we see, points directly back to the world. It was an attempt by humans to understand the world by producing media. And so the image produces magic, and the capacity to imagine images is what created this magical being in the world. And so this is the first alienation. And it worked for a while, but eventually humans stopped believing in the image. Some of the imaginary humans went insane and invented history. So the invention of history is coextensive, Flusser says, with the communication technology of linear text. Information encoded in texts is an attempt to explain these images that we no longer directly believe in. So this is what produced the world that we're familiar with, the one that we'd like to think we still live in, the world of science and history and conceptual reason and explanation. Unfortunately, the answer to why we feel so weird, according to Flusser, and I think I agree, is that we no longer believe in texts. Right? We have become alienated from the world of history. And this is because, in fact, the vast majority of the information that we receive today is encoded in technical images, not in texts. And we don't see the actual book, the lengthy text that defined historical reason is not how we communicate very much today at all. Instead, the technical image includes everything from the photograph to the meme to the statistical curve. So these are things which we don't fully understand what they mean. They were produced initially by experts to explain texts, but they have slipped out of the realm of expertise into mass communication, and they are covering us today. And the reason why everything is so weird is because we don't know what they mean. And so the crucial task, Flusser says, and I agree, is to develop technical imagination, or in other words, to understand what these images mean. So one more component of the framework I have to walk through is the way in which causality and time are different in each of these three periods. So causality, time are important to me as a social scientist, and I think all of us who are familiar with conceptual reason, these are central to how we understand the world. In the first period, the period of the image or magic, time works like eternal recurrence. So this is circular time, where the sun causes the moon, spring causes summer, and it's a circle that never goes anywhere. Right? This was a terrifying world to live in. No one understood anything. But once they invented history and the text, this is when we begin to explain things, to understand them. And the time that emerges is the linear time of progress. So this is the time in which there are causal chains proceeding forward. So we go from the past, causes the present, causes the future. And if we could only understand, if we could explain all of this, we would know where we were. So this is the world in which we are trained from childhood in schools to understand historical time and progress. The problem, though, is that the current period is one of the technical image. We'll call it post-history for now. And this combines the two previous periods in terms of the way in which time and causality operate. So this is circular progress. Right? This is a progress in which A causes B, B causes A, and we're still in a circle, but there's progress. Each time we go around the circle, everything becomes intensified. We could also call this cybernetic time. And one of the crucial insights that emerged from our reading group was the idea that this exact move from history, from the linear time to post-history of circular progress, is mirrored on social media when we switch from the chronological feed to the algorithmic feed around 2016. And this is exactly the period in which everything starts to get really weird. So I think this precise insight into the relationship between causality and time and the way in which information is encoded has a clear advantage at answering the question of why are things weird and why are they so weird since 2016. So this image demonstrates what circular progress looks like. There's obviously only so much we can do with a static image, but we have the texts with which we're familiar are fed into the apparatus operator complex, what he calls the media apparatus, in which people are communicating with the apparatus and cannot be understood except in reference to the apparatus. This apparatus produces technical images, everything from cable news to tweets, right? And then we, humans who are still trained, who are still encoded in the previous era of textual reason, attempt to explain these technical images using the techniques of conceptual reason. We produce texts that are explanations of those images. But the problem is those texts are themselves fed back into the apparatus operator complex. So we see here the circularity of this image. Information is going around and around, but we're not going anywhere in particular. And yet every time we go through this circular progress, everything is becoming intensified. So our ability to explain is getting weaker. The apparatus-operator complex is getting stronger. So Flusser specifically predicts that when we have this circular progress without being able to understand it, without having developed technical imagination, life will become ever lonelier and more senseless, which I think we can all relate to. What happens when we try to do this explanation, when we try to engage technical images in the way in which we have been trained? I think it produces impotence. It's very clear that we're not able to explain what's going on. It produces paranoia, literally false knowledge, as Flusser explains. And so the quote is that the world codified by texts becomes a paranoiac prison. I think this explains why conspiracy theories, paranoid thinking abound today. We are constantly barraged by technical images, and we're trying to figure out what they mean. We're desperately trying to explain them, and yet we can't. We don't know what they mean. And so this is what produces paranoia. And although this is happening to our society overall, he says this critical point is reached individually by each one of us over and over as soon as we lose faith and interest in explanations, theories, ideologies, in history, and in progress. And so this is the brutal irony, the contradiction between how we are trained, how we were raised in school, which is still the fundamental technology of linear historical progress, and then our experience on our smartphones and on the internet, both when we leave school, perhaps during school. This contradiction is destined to produce a lack of faith in text and in historical explanations, and yet we are still forced to use these techniques, which produces paranoia. Another classic tool of people like me, people we might call word cells, who are committed to this dying technology, is critical theory. Right? So the task of the critical theorist, according to Mannheim, is to tear off the mask from the face of those who program us, to see what stands behind the messages that come in through the media. We can think about traditional Chomskyan analysis, which says, well, we see that the rich corporations are the ones who run the television companies, and they are all in cahoots to keep the corporations and capitalism in charge. Right? And that's still part of the explanation, right? So we definitely see today's big corporations in the form of VCs, venture capitalists like Mark Andreessen, who are explicitly demonstrating their goal of producing these traps, these social media platforms in which to entrap word cells who believe that they are actually engaging with people, communicating, when in fact they're stuck in a Skinner box in which they're playing a video game that they don't understand and yet are dedicated to clicking the buttons. So sure, Andreessen is able to extract lots of money from this process, but he is himself merely an operator in the larger apparatus of capitalism. So there's still explanation here, this critical theory approach, but I think it's clear that this does not explain all of the problem. Right? So we look at this image, we look at the image of these people attempting to eat as much extreme blue Takis fire noodles as possible, and if we try to explain it in the critical theory mode, what is the goal? Who's benefiting from this? What is the ideology that these people are promoting? And it's clear this is absurd. It's clear that this does not mean anything. This is a technical image which has no meaning that we can understand. And so I think this demonstrates that it's not simply the recipients of technical images who are being programmed. It's also, Flusser says, the producers. So those who participate actively in the production of information are themselves being programmed by the mass media meat choppers for information production. So just as the people who receive the information don't know what they're doing, so do the people who produce the information, the content on social media, not understand what they're doing. And the most important part of this technical image, I would say, is in the bottom left corner, the 15 million views. This is what's most important to the apparatus, the fact that there is engagement going on. It doesn't matter for any human purposes what that information is. It just matters that there is engagement. So we see things getting even weirder. The emergence of new forms of communication that no one could begin to explain, like ASMR. Right? So this is an emergent phenomenon of these platforms that connect producers and consumers that no one understood or designed. It was simply that some consumers decided, oh, I like this for some reason. And then some producers decided, oh, it looks like when I make these weird noises, I get more views. And each time through this cycle, it became intensified. It kind of evolved from this apparatus. But it doesn't mean anything. And so from our condition as historical humans, it is intolerable to be programmed in a state of lack of awareness by operators who lack awareness of what they are doing. So none of the people involved know what this means, but we're still doing it because we've been programmed by the apparatus to either like it for some reason or to just try to get as many views as we can. So it might be okay if things were stable or at least going slowly enough for us to adapt. But the problem is things are going faster and faster. They're only accelerating. And so it is intolerable not only because such programming works so well, but because it works progressively better. There is no hope that the circle will somehow crack open by itself. We have no possibility of some kind of radical situationist intervention in which some performance artist makes a post which somehow causes us to wake up and say, oh, what have we been doing? This doesn't mean anything. We should do something else, which is actually about communication with another human. No, instead, the longer the circle gyrates, the better it functions. And so we are emerging more and more strange forms of content on social media. The recent example, which I think just perfectly encapsulates what's going on, is the NPC trend. This Pinky doll is on a live stream in which the audience is able to directly program her actions. The commenters tell her what to do, right? And so there's this immediate feedback between the audience and the producer, and yet there's no sense of it meaning anything. No one is trying to communicate anything that anyone understands. So no one knows why it's happening. And this, Flusser says, is the essence of our crisis. It's clear that the people who are watching Pinky doll streams have abandoned historical reason, textual explanation. But the crisis, he says, is that by leaping from texts to technical images, by abandoning historical consciousness without achieving a new one, we might lose consciousness altogether and fall into the abyss of unconscious programming. Communication ceases being a bridge between humans and becomes a prison. So that's what Mark Andreessen would love if we all became trapped in a little Skinner box and he's able to extract some money from this process of NPCs and audiences programming each other. But I think people like Flusser and like me, and I imagine most of y'all who have other goals for human communication, like freedom, like intentionality, can see that this is a problem. And the solution of this problem is the answer to the question, what is tactical imagination? And so we spent a long time in the reading group trying to answer this question, and we don't know. That's the essence of the problem right now, is trying to develop this technical imagination. One thing I do know is that there's not any words I could say right now. There's not words I could put up here or an equation or some kind of explanation which would actually be the answer to this question. The form of the answer to the question, what is technical imagination, will likely look very different from the way the question is posed. But I today only have the tools of conceptual reason, linear texts, the word cell toolkit. And these tools are still useful for first posing the question, and second, ruling out some dead ends. So there are some attempts to answer this question which are not good. So Flusser, who again fled the Nazis, whose entire family was killed by them, points out that this attempt to intentionally retreat from conceptual reason back into the world of magic will not work. One may burn texts and thus try to open the way toward magical imagination, Nazism. Nazism is not good magic. It is a bad faith because one cannot will belief in imagination. So today, I think a lot of young people have realized the impotence of historical reason, and there's this push by some of them towards esotericism, this search for some kind of hidden magical meaning within those texts they no longer believe in. And Flusser says that this is a mistake, and I think that is correct. That there's not some hidden little secret that has been denied to us, that if we could only uncode it from the texts, we would then be able to live a fully authentic life. No, the only way out is forward, is understanding what these technical images mean. And yet this is a very scary situation. Although totalitarian apparatus are a horrible prospect, so is the new human. He cannot be humane in the historical sense. It is our difficulty, to the extent to which we are still committed to historical freedom and the dignity of human action and passion, to the extent to which we are old humans. And I am largely an old human. I still am committed to the dignity of human action and passion, to human freedom. And yet these are historical ideals. And so the question for me is how to rotate them into the current period, how to preserve as much as possible about these ideals in which I believe, while still adapting to the current situation. So I wish, frankly, that this were not happening. I wish that we could still live in the world of texts. I find it quite comfortable and a fun little puzzle to solve. But yet, I think that the best solution is to try to make this leap into the new. Because the alternative is worse. The alternative is ice cream so good on a human face forever. Pinky doll saying this because someone paid her to ad nauseum. So Flusser says we stand on the threshold of a new level of existence on which human life would attain a radically new meaning. And as we stand on that threshold, all we do is watch TV and talk idly about it. So I think this is a far worse answer than a dramatic leap into the new, a dramatic attempt to develop technical consciousness, technical imagination. And so although it will mean sacrificing a lot of these principles and values that I hold dear, and that I think many of us who were raised in the historical textual world are committed to, it is better than the alternative. And so that is why we need new models.